Virex stood high above the clouds, watching the strange blue planet below his ship silent and cloaked in the sky, like a shadow hidden from all human eyes. He stared at Earth with cold silver eyes and a mind full of pride, for he was a high scientist from the Arxan Empire, and the Arxans believed they were the most advanced species in the galaxy, their minds sharp, their bodies strong, their emotions erased long ago. To avoid weakness, they saw emotion as a disease, a flaw that held back growth and logic. Virex was sent to Earth not to greet or speak, but to observe and judge, to measure the threat level of this small chaotic world the humans called home. From the stars, humans looked like wild creatures, full of fear, war, passion, and pain. They built cities, but burned them too. They created peace, but loved conflict. They cried, they laughed, they danced in fire, and that made no sense to Virex. His ship hovered above a small human city where buildings stretched to the sky and lights blinked in strange colors. He adjusted his sensors and focused on a large square building full of young humans. The sign outside read "School" in large red letters. Children ran outside for what seemed like a drill. Virex assumed it was for safety and watched with mild interest, but then something strange happened. The sky turned dark, smoke filled the air, and flames burst from the side of the building. It was not a drill, it was a real fire. Something had gone wrong. He expected to see panic and terror. He expected children to run and scream and fall, but what he saw instead made his cold heart twitch. They were laughing, some were screaming, yes, but others laughed and shouted like they were playing a game. They weaved through smoke, held hands, helped each other, and even when the heat licked their clothes, their faces were full of strange joy, not fear. He moved closer, his ship invisible above them, and activated sound sensors. Now he could hear their voices. A boy yelled, "This is awesome," and others shouted, "Race you to the exit." A girl laughed and said, "Pretend the floor is lava," and they leaped across burning tiles like it was a game and not danger. One even stopped to help a smaller child and smiled through the smoke. This made no sense to Virex. Their planet was on fire, and their young were playing in it. He ran the moment through logic scans, but the result was always the same. Human behavior was illogical by Arxan standards, but somehow this chaos felt like strength, not madness. He watched as firefighters arrived and the children gathered outside, some coughing, some with soot on their skin, but all standing strong. Some laughed, others hugged, and a few even made jokes about the flames behind them. Virex focused on one boy who had lost a shoe and had burned his leg slightly, yet he smiled and said to a teacher, "I'll do better next time, I promise." What did that mean, better next time? Were they trained for this? Did they expect fire to come again? Virex tapped into the city records and found something shocking. This was not the first time this school had faced fire. Years ago, there was a similar event, and before that an earthquake drill and a flood simulation. Earth was a dangerous place, and humans did not hide from danger. They taught their children to face it, to smile through it, to walk into it and come out stronger. He remembered the Arxan children back home, raised in safe chambers, full of soft light and perfect air, taught only numbers and facts, shielded from fear, pain, sorrow, or loss. None of them would have survived 10 minutes in that burning schoolyard. Virex felt something strange in his chest, a tight feeling like his core was squeezing. Something he did not understand. It was not fear, not sadness, perhaps curiosity, perhaps respect. He watched one last moment as a girl walked past the camera, her face covered in ash, her eyes bright. She looked up into the sky, not knowing he was there, and she whispered something. He heard it through the wind. "It's just fire, we're fine." He stepped back from the console, eyes wide, his claws trembling. For the first time in his long life, he did not feel superior. He felt unsure, and that was dangerous for an Arxan. He recorded the event and labeled the file. Observation 1, subgroup children, Earth, status, unusual reaction to extreme threat. Then he marked the file with something no Arxan had used before, a warning not of danger, but of misunderstanding. "We may be wrong about them." As he sat back in his chair and looked down at the world below, he knew this mission was no longer simple. It was not just about study now, it was about understanding. What kind of species laughed in the face of fire? What kind of species trained their young in pain and still walked forward? What kind of species danced in the middle of hell and smiled at the sky? He would have to stay longer and see more. Earth was not weak. Earth was something else entirely, and its children were not afraid. Virex sat alone in the command chair of his silent vessel, floating far above the spinning Earth. His mind was restless and full of questions. His logic engines failed to explain what he had witnessed only hours before, and he knew the answer would not be found in the skies above, but in the long shadows of Earth's past. So he began to dig deeper into the archives of human history, a place full of blood-fire screams, and somehow laughter too. He tapped into the global networks hidden behind cloaks of encryption the humans believed unbreakable, but to arcs in code, it was like peeling fruit layer by layer, page by page. He opened records that spanned thousands of Earth years, wars, famines, plagues, global collapses, each more terrifying than the last. And yet every single time the humans rose again, never unchanged, never untouched, but always standing, always moving forward like a tide that refused to break against the rocks. He watched ancient footage of a city turned to ash by a single bomb. He studied black and white images of children covered in dust, pulling their siblings from rubble, faces marked by burns and tears. Yet still standing then, he saw something even more strange in the same city. Only a few decades later, humans danced in the streets, sang songs, built parks over ruins, smiled under the same sky that once rained fire. And this pattern repeated itself. Again and again, war followed by peace, disaster followed by music, pain followed by love. Virex could not understand it, so he turned to another form of data, the digital records of what humans called movies, games, literature, and music, strange forms of expression, where they stored fragments of their inner world. And what he found there shook him more than any history log could ever do. He watched a movie where a soldier threw himself on a grenade to save his team, and the audience cheered and cried. He read a novel about a woman who lost her family in a flood and still found beauty in the sunrise, and he listened to a song where the singer whispered, "I have walked through fire, and still I breathe," and the melody was not sad, it was full of strength. To Arkson's, emotion was noise to be silenced. To humans, emotion was fuel to be burned in the forge of their spirits. Again and again, Virex saw humans take their pain and turn it into something greater, laughter, art, courage, teaching it to their children as if it were a gift, not a curse. He read journal entries of survivors who smiled through pain, not because it was easy, but because others depended on them. He studied interviews with soldiers who lost limbs and returned to train others with metal arms and bright eyes. They did not cry, they rebuilt. Virex recalled the burning school, the laughter and fire, the girl who said, "It's just fire, we're fine." And now he understood that it was not madness, it was memory, the memory of ancestors who had walked through worse, who had handed down not just survival skills, but the strength to smile in suffering. And now their children were walking through flame, not alone, but with the weight of history behind them like armor. He turned his gaze to a different kind of archive, the ancient libraries of Earth, not just data, but stories passed down for centuries, tales of monsters, storms, endless winters. And yet in every tale the human survives, not by being the strongest, not by being the smartest, but by refusing to fall even when broken. He read myths where heroes walked into the underworld just to save a friend. He saw legends where children faced beasts with nothing but a torch and returned to tell the tale. Why do they seek darkness? Virex asked the empty chamber. Why do they walk into pain when they could run from it? And the only answer that echoed back was this: perhaps they do not see pain as the end, but as the path through which they grow. He pulled up a file from a place called Chernobyl, a ruined land poisoned by the very hands that built it. And yet decades later, he saw teams of young humans exploring it, not in fear, but in curiosity, even reverence. They called it haunting, but beautiful, a place where life still found ways to grow. And even now animals returned, and grass rose between cracked walls, and Virex felt something stir within him, again a question not of fear, but of awe. "They do not hide their mistakes," he whispered. "They wear them like armor, teach their children the stories, so they never forget. They do not erase history, they carry it even when it burns." He turned to another screen, this time a live feed of a place called New Orleans, where water once swallowed streets and left bodies in the dark, but now music echoed from the same alleys, where people once wept, laughter bounced from walls rebuilt with shaking hands, and children danced in puddles where their ancestors had drowned, and yet they smiled and sang. And he saw an old man playing a brass horn, his eyes wet but his hands steady, and the song he played was not sad, it was bold, full of life. Virex had never seen anything like it, a species that remembered every scar and still reached for the stars, their world full of fire, their hearts full of storms, and yet they walked forward, not away from pain, but toward it, as if every broken thing held a lesson, every loss held a seed, every scream a song waiting to be sung. He reviewed psychological studies, notes written by human minds trying to understand themselves. Trauma, they said, could either break you or make you, and most chose the latter. They believed in rising not once, but as many times as needed. They saw tears as proof of trying, and they did not fear failure, they feared standing still. To the Arcsans, perfection was stillness, harmony, without struggle, peace, without weight. But to humans, perfection was motion, growth, learning. They did not want stillness. They wanted to climb, even if it hurt, even if it burned, even if they fell again and again. And this frightened Virex, because it meant they could never be conquered, not truly. He looked again at the children in the burning school, and now he saw not weakness, but inheritance, a long line of ancestors who had walked through war, storms, plagues, and left behind not just stories, but strength. Now he saw the games they played as training, the laughter and danger, as a message to each other, saying, "We are not afraid, because we come from survivors, we come from fire." He sat in silence for a long time, and then he added a second report. This one marked critical revision. Subject: Earth species. Human classification: unstable. Potential: high. Recommended observation extended. He did not know what the Arcsan Council would say. When they read it, perhaps they would laugh. Perhaps they would ignore him. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Earth was not a planet of weakness. It was a planet of fire, and its children were flames walking through darkness without fear. And the longer he watched, the more he began to wonder what would happen if Earth ever turned its gaze to the stars, not in defense, but in hunger for more, for challenge, for growth, for conquest, not to destroy, but to evolve. What happens when a species forged in pain finally decides to shape the galaxy in its image? Virex did not know the answer, but he would stay to find out. The cold wind cut through the trees like a whisper of ice, and the white sky hung heavy over a stretch of wilderness far from any city roads or machines. Virex stood cloaked and invisible in the frozen forest, watching the line of small human figures moving slowly through snow that reached their knees. These were not soldiers, not survival experts, not adults. They were children no older than 12, dragging sleds, backpacks, ropes, and tools across the frozen wasteland with nothing but each other and their training to guide them. He had followed them for 2 days, watched from high in the sky and low behind trees as they moved through the forest like ants through frost. At first, he thought they were lost. Then he scanned their gear, their clothes, their routes, and realized this was no accident. This was an exercise, a program designed not for punishment, but for growth. And Virex felt confusion and awe war inside him, because he had never seen such a thing, not even in the most elite Arcsan combat units. The group had been dropped off by loud spinning machines and left alone with instructions and supplies. Their goal was simple: survive for 1 week in the snow, reach the beacon 5 miles away, and do it together. No prizes, no rankings, no escape, just cold hunger and the biting wind. And these children moved with the calm focus of trained minds, pushing each other forward through howling weather and falling snow. He zoomed in on their faces, some red and raw from the wind, some streaked with tears, but none showed fear. They walked through frozen rivers and up icy hills, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent, sometimes singing strange songs to keep rhythm in the snow. They built fires in the dark, boiled ice to drink, shared food from ration packs, and when one child grew tired, they carried her on a sled without complaint or command. Virex remembered the emotionless halls of Arcsan youth chambers, where young ones learned from machines in sterile rooms, with no heat, no wind, no pain, no chance to fail or fall or freeze. And he wondered now if that had been a mistake, because these human children were learning something far beyond survival. They were learning how to depend, how to push, how to become more than just one body in the cold. They were learning how to become a unit without ever being told. He watched a girl with frost on her lashes lead the group up a slope using sticks to find safe steps, her voice calm, her eyes sharp. Behind her, a boy with cracked lips helped another, who had slipped, tying a rope around both their waists so neither could fall alone. And at night they curled together in tents like wolves, sharing warmth and stories, and small glowing screens that showed pictures of home, not to make them weak, but to remind them why they fought the cold. On the 4th day, a storm rolled in sudden, and brutal trees shook, and snow flew sideways in sharp blasts, and the group stopped moving. They huddled against a rocky outcrop, building walls from branches and ice, covering tents with layers of snow for warmth. And one girl, with a broken ankle, was wrapped in sleeping bags, while the others took turns feeding her, talking to her, holding her hand, so she would not sleep too deep or too long. Virex stood meters away inside the storm, and felt nothing through his suit, but he knew the cold was real, brutal, deadly, and these children were enduring it not because they were forced, but because they had chosen this path. They had entered this place, knowing what could happen, and still they came not to win, but to grow, and that made them something different, something dangerous. He recorded their movements, their conversations, their struggles, and sent a silent report back to the Arxen Council. Marked observation: 3 subgroup youth Earth species, human capable of unity, under stress capable of adaptation, in hostile conditions, emotional bonds increase efficiency. On the 6th day, the girl with the broken ankle asked to be left behind. She said she was slowing them down, that she would make camp and wait for rescue. The others refused without hesitation. They built a sled from branches, tied it together with cord, and carried her across a frozen lake, singing songs from a movie Virex had once dismissed as foolish fantasy, something called Frozen, and as they sang he saw tears on their faces. But they never stopped moving, not even when the ice cracked beneath them, not even when the sled nearly tipped. He felt something inside him tremble, not fear, not respect, but something older, something raw, memory, from arcs and myths of long ago, when even his people had walked through pain and fire, before they traded it for machines and stillness. Maybe they had forgotten something important, maybe Earth had remembered. As the children reached the final mile, they were gaunt, red-eyed, worn down, but unbroken, and when the beacon blinked through the trees, like a cold star, they ran not for glory, but for each other, helping the slow, cheering for the weak, making sure no one was left behind. And when they arrived and the snow machines came to lift them into the sky, they stood tall, faces cracked, and smiling, frost still clinging to their lashes, and Virex felt like he was watching a species of ghosts who had died in the storm and returned stronger. Later that night he flew over the same forest, empty now, but marked with footprints, paths tense, and small fires still burning, and he wondered how many Arxen children could have done the same, how many would have cried, begged, surrendered in the cold, how many would have grown stronger instead of bitter, how many would have found warmth in each other, and he knew the answer was too small, too few, and he felt shame. He studied the program records and found this was normal, this was routine across Earth. Children were trained in deserts, jungles, mountains, and war zones, not to become killers, but to learn courage, not to teach violence, but to understand survival, not to promote fear, but to teach how to stand in it, and walk through it, and smile on the other side. He watched recordings of other survival camps, where children swam through freezing water, climbed cliffs blindfolded, slept under open skies during lightning storms, and every time they laughed, they cheered, they helped each other, and never once did they say this is too much, only always we can do more. Virex closed the files and sat in silence as the star spun slowly around the Earth, and he realized the truth that had been forming since his first moment, watching that burning school. Earth was not just a planet of strange wild creatures, it was a training ground to forge, and its children were not soft, not weak. They were shaped by ice, by fire, by hunger and love, and pain, all wrapped together into something fierce and new. He stared at the clouds drifting below, and whispered to himself words no Arxen had spoken in generations. Maybe this is what strength really looks like. And he knew he could not leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what else Earth was hiding. Not until he knew what these children would become when they grew up and reached for the stars. The night sky above Earth flickered with quiet storms as Virex hovered in the dark, near a strange facility built in the shadows of a mountain. The place was large and circular with armored walls and strange markings across the steel panels, glowing symbols in red and orange that pulsed like a heartbeat every 10 seconds. The wind carried the low hum of machines far beneath the surface, and even from his vessel Virex could feel the heat rising from the depths like breath from a sleeping beast. He had followed a group of human youths here, not soldiers, not scientists, not trained warriors, just teenagers from a learning academy. Their faces were young, but their eyes held something deeper, something shaped by fire and memory. They laughed as they entered the gates, unaware of the cloaked alien observer above their heads. And even if they knew he was there, he sensed they would not have cared. They carried a certain boldness, a kind of light that burned against fear, and Virex had seen that light before in the eyes of children who played in smoke and danced on ice. He accessed the records of the structure and found its name, Project Tartarus, and its purpose was more than training, it was transformation. Inside this mountain was a simulation chamber capable of bending reality, generating environments pulled from human imagination and memory, not just virtual, but physical storms, fire beasts, shadows, and terrain, all crafted to test the human mind and body. far beyond normal limits, designed to replicate the most brutal places in history and legend combined with the fears of those who entered. The teens suited up in light armor skin-tight suits with glowing circuits and helmets shaped like skulls of old myths. They looked like ghosts from some forgotten battle, and when the doors opened they stepped into a world not made of steel or glass, but of shifting volcanic rock skies, of ash rivers of flame, and mountains that bled smoke from open wounds. Virex scanned the simulation code and saw the setting had been chosen randomly from a list of survival scenarios. This one was called Hell Level 6, and no participant had ever completed it without failure, injury, or psychological collapse. He watched from a hidden chamber inside the wall where his suit allowed him to blend with stone and light, and as the simulation began he saw the teens running through molten paths, chased by firestorms and creatures shaped like nightmares, bodies of molten rock, eyes of lightning, claws like razors. But none of the teens screamed. They shouted to each other, gave commands, jumped over pits of lava, and when one fell the others turned back to help, never leaving anyone behind. Virex observed the sensors tracking heart rates, brainwaves, muscle strain, and emotional spikes. The readings were shocking. Fear was present, but not dominant. Pain was recorded, but processed quickly, not ignored, but accepted. Each subject showed high levels of focus, even joy, as if they were not trapped in a nightmare, but living inside a challenge, and loving every second of it. They fought monsters with sticks and homemade tools. They formed lines and broke traps. They built shelters from burning stones and shared breath inside them, waiting out firestorms with songs from their childhoods. In one segment, a teen named Alara stood before a chasm with only a narrow bridge of glass stretched across the lava, and behind her a creature of ash and bone rose from the ground. She turned to the others and smiled, then stepped onto the glass, not to escape, but to draw the beast after her. Her movements were slow, steady, eyes locked on the flames, and when the creature charged, she led it across the bridge and shattered it with a single strike, both falling into the heat below. The others cried out, but not in panic. They formed a plan, took a different route, carried her memory like a flag, and 20 minutes later she reappeared at the checkpoint, bruised and laughing, covered in fake burns and simulation. Ash saying, "I thought I was done, then I remembered we always come back." And Virex felt a deep chill inside, not from fear, but from something colder than space, the realization that these humans were not learning to fight. They were learning to fall and rise again with no hesitation, no pause, just forward motion always. He studied their profiles and found they had volunteered for this experience, not because they had to, but because they wanted to challenge themselves, face something impossible, and prove it could be done. Their families cheered them on, their mentors watched from the observation room with pride, and the teens had trained for months with discipline that rivaled elite military units, except they were not preparing for war. They were preparing for life beyond Earth, where no comfort existed, only danger and unknown forces waiting in the dark. Virex activated a backup observer unit and sent it into the simulation to test the environment for himself. Within seconds his systems overheated, his sensors flooded with false pain signals, his balance broke, and his logic processors screamed in protest. He stumbled across scorched ground, breathing in toxic code meant to mimic ash and flame. His vision blurred, and he fell into a pit of screaming faces generated from fears he had never known. He tried to retreat, but the simulation pulled him deeper, until he ejected an emergency protocol barely stable. The teens had lasted hours inside that same hell and emerged stronger, laughing, sharing food and memories of the chaos, like warriors returning from a grand hunt. And he could not understand, it could not accept that what broke him in minutes they turned into a playground of fire and ash where they tested courage and memory and heart without hesitation. He watched them exit the chamber covered in burns and cuts that faded after a few minutes, the simulation healing their bodies, but leaving the lessons marked in their minds. And they stood in the open air of the mountain base, arms around each other, grinning, with eyes still shining with fire. And when asked if they wanted to go again, they all shouted yes, and Virex believed them. He returned to his ship and sat in silence, not looking at the stars, but at the recordings on his screen, each frame showing fire, each face showing joy, each failure followed by laughter and resolve. And he realized the truth: humans did not just endure pain, they invited it. They welcomed tests, trials, losses, not because they were foolish, but because pain was their teacher, challenge their guide, and death only a temporary stop in the journey of becoming more. He recorded his fourth report, marked it priority red, and sent it in silence, labeled Subject Earth Youth Development through simulated suffering result, enhanced emotional and tactical resilience comment, suggest ARCSN training protocol review, suggest reassessment of human threat level. As his ship lifted higher above the mountain, he looked back one last time and saw the teens standing at the edge of the cliff, staring at the stars, where his ship floated invisible, and one of them raised a hand in salute, not knowing who was watching, not caring, just proud, unbroken, and full of fire. Virex closed the screen and whispered to the dark, "They do not train to fight, they train to become unstoppable." And somewhere deep in his memory, he wondered what Earth would become when all its children, who learned in fire, finally came of age and took their first steps beyond the stars, not with fear, but with joy. Snowflakes drifted gently over the rooftops of a small village tucked between the mountains, where smoke rose from chimneys, and the scent of warm bread filled the air, and beneath it all a stillness lay quiet like the breath of something ancient. Virex hovered above the village, cloaked in silence, watching as the people below moved slowly through the day. Old and young, side by side, their lives simple, yet layered with something deeper, something unseen, something earned through years of fire, sorrow, and strength. He had seen the children play in flames, he had watched the youth walk through frozen storms and train inside burning simulations, but now he wanted to understand the roots, where that strength began, where the first seeds were planted. So he turned his gaze to the oldest generation, those who had lived through the world's sharpest trials, those who had faced real war, real hunger, real loss, and still stood upright, still smiled, still taught with voices like iron wrapped in warmth. In a small home with peeling paint and a porch held together by age and memory, Virex found her an old woman named Mira, with silver hair tied in a braid that reached her waist, and eyes like dark wells full of storms and light. She sat by the fire in a wooden chair carved by hand, and around her sat children, 6 of them with bare feet and wide eyes, clutching cups of hot drink and pieces of sweet bread. And when she began to speak, even the wind outside seemed to pause. She told them of a time when fire fell from the sky, not stars, but bombs, when cities vanished in clouds of dust, when the ground itself shook and swallowed homes and families. And hope. She told them of hunger that stretched across months of winters, where shoes were made from rags and laughter had to be built from nothing but breath. She did not weep as she spoke, she smiled, and the children leaned closer, not in fear, but in awe. Virex watched through the window unseen, recording every word, her voice low and steady like a heartbeat. She said, "We did not have much, but we had each other. We had songs and hands and stories. And when the world turned dark, we learned how to light it again, not with machines, but with love, with courage, with truth." And the children listened, not because they were forced, but because they knew every word was real, every word was earned. Later she gave each child a piece of string from her sewing kit and told them to tie a knot for each time they had been afraid, and kept going, and they did. And then she tied one too, and said, "This is not weakness, this is memory." And Virex felt something stir inside him, like a quiet storm, a question that had no answer. He moved to another place, a care center, where old men with metal arms and quiet smiles played games with each other and taught young ones how to fix engines, build tools, understand maps. And one of them, a man with only one eye and no legs, rolled across the room to show a boy how to carve wood. And as he did, he told the story of a time when he carried his friend through smoke with a broken spine, and said he would do it again, not because he was brave, but because there was no other choice. The children nodded and asked questions, and never once looked away, never once showed pity, only interest, only pride. And Virex saw that these stories were not told to cause sorrow, but to pass on strength, the way ARCSNs passed on code. These humans passed on pain, shaped into memory, shaped into love, shaped into lessons that could never be unlearned. He found footage of an old man teaching children to box, not for violence, but for balance, for breath, for knowing how to stand when the wind is strong. He told them, "Fall 7 times, stand up 8. And they repeated it like a prayer, like a truth carved into stone. And when one child fell and cried, the others lifted him, without teasing, without scorn, only hands, only warmth. He moved across cities, towns, deserts, jungles, and found the same thing in every place. The old ones did not fade into silence. They became living libraries full of scars and laughter, full of stories that guided the young, not away from danger, but into it with open eyes and strong hearts. They taught not how to avoid fear, but how to speak to it, look it in the eyes, and say, I am still here. In one place, a man who had survived 3 wars stood before a classroom of teenagers and told them the worst pain is not the bullet, but the silence that follows. And then he smiled and said, so we speak, we sing, we shout, and we never stay silent again. And the room erupted in cheers, not because of war, but because of truth. Virex reviewed arcs in history, where the old were hidden, where weakness was erased and emotion silenced, and he saw now the difference. Earth did not erase its pain, it wrote it down, carved it into stone, painted it into murals, danced it into songs, and passed it hand to hand like a torch, and every child who took it did so not with fear, but with pride, because they knew they came from fire, and they would carry it forward. He watched a grandmother sit with her grandson and teach him how to plant a tree where once a bomb had fallen. She said, this is how we fight, not always with fists, sometimes with roots. And the boy nodded and placed a seed in the soil, and Virex felt his heart tremble with something unfamiliar, something close to reverence. He studied the data and wrote his 5th report, labeled Observation. 5 subject elders, transmission of resilience through memory and emotion result. Human youth demonstrate increased psychological stability and social cohesion due to intergenerational knowledge flow. Recommendation: do not underestimate emotional legacy as tactical asset. And as he sent it, he looked once more at the small house in the mountains where Mira sat by the fire and told stories of hunger and laughter, of death and rebirth, of silence and song. And he thought about the children who would grow up with those stories in their blood, not as weight, but as wings. He whispered to himself, these are not just survivors, they are teachers, they are builders, they are the reason Earth stands unbroken. And then he knew that Earth was not a planet filled with young flames alone. It was a place where ancient fires still burned, where the oldest voices still echoed, where the past was not forgotten, but woven into the future, like thread made of iron and gold. And somewhere deep inside, Virex began to wonder what it would feel like to have a story of his own, not just a record, but a memory, not just logic, but meaning. And he sat in the dark above Earth and listened to the old ones speak words that would live forever in the hearts of those yet to be born. The sky above the academy burned with color as dawn spilled across the clouds, painting gold across the steel towers that reached toward space. Like the hands of giants, the earth beneath them hummed with quiet energy, and the distant sound of engines rising. Virex hovered above the central plaza, hidden from all eyes, cloaked in silence, as he watched the future of humanity stand in rows, dressed in dark uniforms, lined with glowing thread symbols of achievement stitched across their chests, each symbol earned through challenge, through suffering, through growth. It was graduation day for the Global Initiative for Planetary Expansion, a program designed to prepare human youth for life beyond Earth, not a ceremony of pomp and hollow words, but a ritual of purpose, where every student had survived simulations, tests, storm survival courses, and ethical trials that pushed their minds to the edge. Virex had seen only fragments of the program until now, but what stood before him was proof that Earth was not preparing for peace, it was preparing for something far greater. A child no older than 16 stepped forward as her name was called, and a list of her achievements echoed across the plaza. She had survived 40 days alone in an artificial wasteland, navigated asteroid fields in zero gravity, built functional water systems in dead zones, trained in psychological response under sensory deprivation, and emerged with a smile, calm eyes, steady voice, no hint of arrogance, only readiness. And when asked what she wanted to do next, she said, I want to lead rescue missions into the collapsed black hole stations. Virex felt the weight of that sentence ripple through the air, as if space itself paused to listen. Humans were not looking for safety, they were reaching toward danger with open hands and clear hearts. The next graduate, a boy who had been born in a refugee zone, stepped forward and spoke of rebuilding destroyed colonies, not as a duty, but as a dream. And behind him, another girl spoke of mapping the gravity scars in deep space, using only instinct and math. And Virex saw a pattern, not of conquest, not of escape, but of mastery over fear and loss. These were not soft minds shaped by comfort. They were blades forged in memory, sharpened by pressure, held steady by hope. They laughed as they stepped forward, some with limps, some with scars, all wearing their pain like medals, not because they wanted to show off, but because they had nothing to hide. One speaker took the stage and said, we do not seek to conquer the stars, we seek to understand them. And if they fight back, we will not kneel, we will not run, we will become. Stronger until the stars make room for us. Virex scanned the crowd and saw families crying with pride not just for survival, but for becoming more than what had been broken mentors, standing still, a stone watching the seeds they planted bloom into giants, and somewhere in the back a group of children barely old enough to speak watched with wide eyes, already dreaming of their turn, already reaching. He accessed the internal data of the academy and found that these students had undergone trials beyond what even ARCs and military elites endured. They had been taught to command ships, negotiate with alien simulations, treat wounds with improvised tools, survive in vacuum, withstand heat, hunger, betrayal, isolation, and all of it wrapped in layers of emotional resilience, exercises no ARCs child had ever known. He opened files showing how they trained in small groups with rotating leaders to prevent ego, how they faced moral paradoxes designed to challenge instinct, how they wrote letters to their future selves before each mission and read them aloud after returning changed and wiser, and through it all they were taught to feel every victory, every loss, every failure, not as shame, but as steps toward something higher. Virex reviewed video logs of a child losing her simulated crew during a catastrophic failure, then returning to the chamber the next day to run the mission again until she saved every last one. And when asked why, she said, "Because if I do not try again, then I never believed I could." And he saw that her mind was not shaped by fear of death, but by respect for life, not driven by ego, but by the belief that growth never ends. The ceremony ended not with fireworks or speeches, but with silence as the graduates placed their hands on a stone carved with names of those who had tried and failed, those who never finished, those who died in training or in real missions, and they stood still, heads bowed in unity, not mourning, but promising that those names were not forgotten, that they were part of every step forward. And Virex felt his heart shift again, not from confusion but from something close to sorrow, not for them but for his own kind who had lost this kind of connection long ago. He wrote his sixth report, marked with the highest priority, labeled Observation 6, Subject Human Youth Ascension Program. Result: subjects demonstrate high-level tactical, cognitive, and emotional growth across multiple environments. Cultural integration of loss as growth drivers suggested strategic delay on direct contact recommendation. Observe long-term evolution path before assessment of threat level. He sent the report and then remained above the academy, watching as the students dispersed into launch crafts, training shuttles, medical transports, and research vessels, all heading in different directions, all carrying with them the fire of Earth, the memory of storms, the songs of their elders, and the dreams of a species that refused to remain where it was born. He followed one ship into orbit, a small exploration vessel piloted by 5 of the graduates, all under the age of 20, and inside they spoke of duty not as burden, but as joy, of risk, not as danger, but as challenge. They played music from their childhoods, mixed with messages from their teachers, reminders of where they came from, and Virex listened to every word, recording every laugh, every quiet moment of reflection, every declaration of intent, not as noise, but as something sacred. They spoke of visiting the broken moons near Saturn, of exploring the signal ruins on Europa, of finding the lost teams from years before and bringing them home, or at least finding answers. And one girl whispered, "I do not fear the dark, I carry my own light," and the others nodded without speaking. Virex stayed with them until they left Earth's gravity well, and then he turned back one last time, looking at the world that had shaped them, looking at the rivers that still ran red with history, the cities still growing from ash, the fields still planted by hands that remembered hunger. And he realized that Earth was not just surviving anymore. Earth was preparing to expand, not with war, not with conquest, but with understanding and fire and the will to walk through darkness and light both. He whispered to himself, "They are ready." And somewhere beyond the stars, something else began to lift. The Arxen fleet moved through the void with the grace of silent death engines, humming beneath black hulls, shaped like the bones of ancient titans. Weapons charged, shields raised, minds linked by thought and purpose and expectation. They had come to Earth not with fear, but with certainty, for in their history no world had ever stood against them, no species had ever caused hesitation, no culture had ever made them pause, not until now, not until Earth. Virex stood at the observation bay of the flagship, watching the blue planet draw near, its atmosphere pulsing with energy, its orbit lined with satellites, its surface a map of scars and beauty and memory. He had sent his reports, he had begged for delay, for caution, for understanding, but the Council had already decided Earth would be tested. Earth would be judged Earth, would be claimed or destroyed, and Virex felt a cold silence grow in his chest, not from fear for himself, but for what might be lost. The commanders spoke in perfect unity, their voices smooth and emotionless, discussing strategy, as if Earth were no more than a puzzle, to be solved, a tool, to be reshaped. They had read his files, they had seen the data, but they had never walked through the fire, never watched children laugh in smoke, never seen a broken world rise with music in its veins and light in its bones. They believed emotion was weakness, they believed memory was burden, they believed pain was flaw, and so they came with the arrogance of gods to test a world of ghosts. Earth did not send ships to meet them, no weapons were launched, no warnings fired. Instead, a single transmission reached the fleet, clear, strong, deliberate, a message from the leaders of Earth, not spoken in fear or fury, but in calm, quiet strength. It said, "We know you are here, we know what you seek. We are not unaware of your reach, we are not blind to your silence. But know this, we do not kneel, we do not run, and we are not alone." Then the message changed, shifting into images not of soldiers or armies, but of moments: a girl standing in fire, a boy walking through snow, a group of children running through storms, with laughter on their lips, a field of graves, with flowers growing through cracked stone, a song rising from a ruined city, a hand reaching out of the rubble to lift another, a scream turned into art, a tear turned into steel. The images burned through the fleet, each frame a memory, not theirs, but felt nonetheless. And then came the face of a child, not angry, not afraid, just steady, her eyes deep with knowing, her voice like wind through stone, saying, "We were not made to conquer, we were made to survive. We were not built to dominate, we were built to endure, and in enduring we grow, we remember, we rise." And then silence, no threats, no declarations, no promises, only the weight of truth, and the deep hum of a species that had died 1,000 times and never stayed dead. Virex watched the commanders shift their stance, their minds flickering with doubt, their unity cracking with questions. He could feel it through the air, through the tremble in their voices, through the quiet between orders, and he knew then that Earth had done what no weapon ever could. It had spoken with its soul, and the soul had been heard. He opened the last report, not for the council, not for the fleet, but for himself, and for any who would come after. Labeled observation 7, subject Earth, result contact, deferred threat assessment, inconclusive recommendation, immediate withdrawal, and strategic silence. Final note: Earth is not to be judged by metrics or logic or fear. Earth is not a species, it is an experience, it is an echo, it is a furnace. Earth is not asleep, Earth is dreaming, and one day it will wake. The order came without fanfare. The fleet would turn the test, was over. The planet would remain untouched, not out of mercy, but out of respect, not from fear of weapons, but from the weight of memory and mystery. The ships peeled away, like shadows, fading from fire, their engines dimming, their minds still grappling with what they had seen, what they had felt, and what they now knew they could never understand. Virex remained behind his ship, drifting in low orbit above the planet. He had come to observe, to measure, to judge, and now to protect, not with force, but with silence. He looked down at the blue world spinning slowly beneath him, the clouds moving like breath, the oceans like veins, the cities like sparks, and he felt something rise in him, not pride, not relief, but belonging. He whispered to the stars, "They play in hell, and they laugh, they fall, and they rise, they remember, and they forgive, they carry fire in their bones and water in their eyes, and they are not afraid of the dark, they carry their own light." He thought of Mira and her stories by the fire of Alara, and the bridge of flame of the old man with one eye, and the child planting trees of the teens who ran through ash, and the students who reached to the stars, and he saw them all now not as moments, but as parts of a whole, as notes in a song, still being written, a song of survival, of sorrow, of strength. He turned away from the controls and let the ship drift, not forward, not back, just still watching, listening, waiting. And somewhere on Earth the child looked up at the sky, eyes full of dreams, full of stars, full of stories, not yet born, and smiled, not knowing, who watched, not needing to know. And above her, far above, hidden from sight, a single alien soul burned quiet with wonder and stayed.